My name is Trudy Jacobsen, and I have written a book called Lost Goddesses, The Denial of Female Power in Cambodian History, published by Nias Press. I'm going to talk a little bit about it. I grew up in Cambodia, and I've always been very interested in the history of the country. One of the things I've noticed as an undergraduate was that there was very little about women in Cambodian history, and I thought this couldn't possibly be true. There had been women around, so there must be some record of them. And doing my PhD thesis, I went back and looked through the Sanskrit records, the Pali records, Old Khmer, the French colonial records, and the more recent Cambodian past, including the Khmer Rouge period. And one of the things I found was that actually, far from being inferior or subservient or in any way downtrodden, Cambodian women have actually had a very high place in Cambodian society, dependent upon what part of society they were in. If you were an elite woman, it was possible that, like your brothers, you could become a queen, you could hold an important position at court, you could certainly own land and slaves. One woman in particular in the 18th century was responsible for a princess she was summoned to the court whenever her brother the king needed some point of law explained to him, so she was important in that regard. Later on, in the French colonial period, we see women not entering into the civil service per se, but still holding very important positions. And at the rural level, for the last 2,000 years that I've been able to work out, men and women, although they may have had different roles, have both been seen as necessary. So there's never been the case that Cambodian women have been considered inferior in Cambodian history. This is a very recent development and is mainly a legacy of ideas that the French brought with them in the late 19th century. As we get into the more modern era, so the middle of the 20th century, these ideas inherited from colonialism maintained a place amongst the Cambodian political elite. So it was thought that women should have a supporting role rather than a primary role. And what's very interesting is this is something that we can see even in the Khmer Rouge period. So you'll have the wife of one of the Khmer Rouge leaders be placed in charge of a portfolio such as welfare, for example, whereas her male counterpart would have something like foreign affairs that took you outside the country. So women were still very much considered to be part of that domestic nurturing role. During the People's Republic of Kampuchea period, from 1979 to 1989, we see much more women entering into important positions. This is largely because after the Khmer Rouge regime, Cambodia's population was predominantly female. And then when we have the Paris Peace process begin in 89 to 91, we start to see refugees returning from the refugee camps and from overseas, then women become marginalised again. And there's this dominant trope, particularly amongst the Khmer diaspora today, that the 1950s and 1960s in Cambodia constitute some kind of golden age. And in this golden age, people seem to remember gender roles of women being at home with the children and men being out in the world. And this is not necessarily the case. So what we're finding in Cambodia today are a lot of competing ideas about the role of women. And this leads to a lot of problems for women who are embracing sentiments such as feminism. Feminism is considered to be something un-Cambodian. And so if you want to be a good Cambodian woman, you must not at all call yourself a feminist, even though you and your family, including your husband, your father, your son, may in fact see that the daughter of the family is just as good as the male. What I'm hoping that this book is going to do is two things. First of all, tell people that women in Cambodian history have had a very important place in that history, which I think has been left out of many previous histories on the country. And secondly, to provide some kind of basis for women in Cambodia to agitate for a fair shake, essentially, from today's politicians that are bent on keeping them trapped in this 1950s, 1960s paradigm of not being able to move outside the house and into a more public role for themselves and for their daughters.